of the infected blood inquiry.
Thank you very much.
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Alicia Cairns.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you for granting this important debate. The solar industry will play an important role in the government's net zero plans, with a target of producing 70 gigawatts of solar energy by 2035, a five-fold increase on our current output. Now, it is absolutely right that solar plays its part in increasing our renewable energy output, but the current rollout lacks national oversight of land use, sufficient consideration of food security issues and protection of agricultural land, and on protections against the widespread exposure of solar supply chains to Uyghur forced labour and genocide. It's very early on, but to my friend, I absolutely will.
Except it's very early on. I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way and for bringing this debate. In 2022, I brought a bill to this House that would have prohibited the importation of products made by forced labour from Xinjiang. I'm sure that nobody in the UK would want to believe that the products that they were buying were the product of slave labour, and it would have put the onus on manufacturers to prove that they hadn't been made by slave labour. Does she agree with me that this would be an important step forward if the government were to adopt such a policy?
I couldn't agree more with my honourable friend, and actually I laid a very similar amendment to the energy bill earlier this year, which I will touch on later, because he is absolutely right. And in 2021, Sheffield Hallam University published a report called In Broad Daylight, Uyghur Forced Labour and the Global Solar Supply Chains. They summarise the situation as many Indigenous workers are unable to refuse or walk away from these jobs, and thus the programmes are tantamount to forcible transfer of populations and enslavement. Their second report, Overexposed, went even further. It created a ranking system for solar companies based on exposure to Uyghur slave labour, which I'll come to later in more details. Now, these two reports were funded by the Foreign Office, and yet their findings do not appear to have been enacted. I will happily give way to my friend.
Can I commend the Honourable Lady for Rutland and Milton for bringing this forward? We spoke earlier on the day. She always leads from the front, and I congratulate the Honourable Lady in doing that on this issue as well. It's an important issue we may not always know very much about, but does the Honourable Lady not agree that any hint of forced labour within this chain cannot ever have government backing and funding, and that we must hold ourselves to the highest standards in matters of forced labour in every supply chain that may be centrally funded? Thank you.
It's no surprise that my honourable friend wishes to speak in this debate, because he always brings compassion and heart and a real care for human rights. And he is absolutely right that if green energy is to make up such a substantial part of our future energy grid, we must not tolerate slave labour within it. As I mentioned in response to my honourable friend, the lovely Scot nationalist thereover, I did indeed lay an amendment trying to make sure that any solar company wishing to build in this country had to make clear their supply chains and that they were free of Uyghur forced labour. Now, the government wasn't willing to support the amendment, but I was assured that they would work with me on the issue. Conversely, I wish to take the opportunity to thank the many members of this House who did back this effort. The Foreign Affairs Committee has also done its own inquiry into exposure to Uyghur slave labour as a follow-up to the genocide situation in Xinjiang, and I have raised it in countless other meetings and debates. And yet we still see no action as dirty solar continues to flood and concrete over our fields and our rooftops, unchecked and unaccountable. That's why last month 43 members of this House and 32 human rights organisations sent a joint statement to the government requesting 3 simple policies that could be enacted to insulate the UK solar market from Uyghur forced labour. The first was to introduce import controls on high-risk industries to insulate our markets. It's not unreasonable, and I don't think it's too onerous, to expect solar developers and manufacturers to demonstrate their supply chains are clean of slave labour before not only operating but profiting in the UK. The second request was targeted sanctions to ban the worst offending companies so they cannot operate in the UK. And the third was complementary measures to diversify solar supply chains away from Xinjiang and Uyghur forced labour. By adopting these, the government could clean up the UK solar industry and ensure our green transition does not come off the back of slavery and genocide. Now, we've yet to... I will indeed.
I thank the honourable member for giving way and also congratulate her for bringing this very important subject before the House. The US and EU are passing laws to ban solar products made by Uyghur slave labour in Xinjiang, which will leave the UK with an abundance of morally compromised solar panels. So does my honourable friend agree that the fight against forced labour should be a collective responsibility? And if so, does my honourable friend also agree that this means the UK government must work for a clean energy transition, but without being complicit in Uyghur forced labour?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman is correct. The UK is risking becoming a global outlier because our international partners have taken action. As he says, the USA passed the Forced Labour Prevention Act in 2021. The EU is in the process of passing legislation to block the imports of goods made with forced labour. And this means that we are becoming a dumping ground for these solar panels. Since June 2022, the US has seized thousands of shipments of solar with links to Xinjiang. And yet we are yet to seize or block a single import ever. The US's import controls are working, with the second Sheffield Hallam report showing that many companies have started creating new supply chains for exports to the US that are clean. But without our own import controls, the UK will continue to welcome dirty solar. Sheffield Hallam's report also offers an assessment of the largest solar companies' exposure to forced labour. Now, whilst the Chinese Communist Party seeks to cover up the genocide it's committing in Xinjiang by banning independent audits and investigations, hiring PR firms and issuing lies on a daily basis, the researchers were able to use open source research to rank the culpability of companies from a scale of none to very high. So let's look at some of those companies, shall we? JA Solar, very high exposure to Uyghur forced labour, yet has continually ranked as the biggest supplier of solar modules to the UK. Jinko Solar, very high exposure, panels widely available to buy in the UK. Longi Solar, very high exposure, panels widely available to buy. Q-Cells, very high exposure, panels widely available to buy. REC Group Twin Peak 4, very high exposure, again widely available to buy. Tongwei Solar, high exposure, partnered with the UK company Polysolar to distribute their panels nationally. Trina Solar, very high exposure, they have an office in Derby. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, that brings me on to Canadian Solar, the company behind the proposed 2,000-acre Malard Pass solar plant in Rutland and Lincolnshire. Now, I wish to put very clearly on the record that anyone who wishes to look at my history in this place knows that I have raised issues around the genocide against the Uyghurs since 2016, long before I came to this House, and specifically again about slave labour with supply chains long before this proposal came to my constituency. But unfortunately, I am now in the situation Rutland faces having Uyghur blood labour on our beautiful green land, and I will not accept it. Canadian Solar's application to build Malard Pass, which will classify as a nationally significant infrastructure due to its enormous size, 2,100 acres, is currently with the Secretary of State, who will decide whether to grant planning permission. I've lost track of the number of times I've raised Canadian Solar, whether it be at the Foreign Affairs Committee or whether it be in this place or in Westminster Hall. Now, people say that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over and expecting different results. But I would argue that in this case, Madam Deputy Speaker, insanity would be allowing a company so linked to the oppression and genocide of the Uyghur people to build key energy infrastructure in our country. The name Canadian Solar is what I will call maple washing, to distract from its true origins and operations of the company. As of December 2022, 86% of their annual solar module manufacturing capacity was in China. 78% of their solar cell manufacturing capacity was in China. And 100% of their annual wafer and ingot manufacturing capacity was in China. And 85% of their employees are based in China. Canadian Solar has letters of credit worth $150 million and short-term notes worth $1.4 billion with Chinese banks. Now, whilst their operating in China is of itself not a concern, it does offer some context as why Canadian solar supply chains are so intricately linked to human rights abuses in Xinjiang. Now, in 2021, 4 shipments of Canadian solar panels were seized by the US government. Why? Because of their links to slave labour from the Uyghur Xinjiang region. Canadian Solar previously operated a solar plant in the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps' 3rd Division city of Tamshuk. The XPCC is a Chinese Communist Party-controlled paramilitary organisation in Xinjiang, heavily implicated in the Uyghur genocide. In fact, 4 of their senior officials were sanctioned by the UK in 2021. According to the Sheffield Hallam report, Canadian Solar likely benefits from this relationship with the XPCC. They also have a joint venture with GCL Poly, one of the largest suppliers of polysilicon. GCL Poly was, yet again, sanctioned by the US. Why? For participating in the practice of accepting or utilising forced labour in Xinjiang and contributing to human rights abuses against Uyghurs and other minority groups in Xinjiang. Now, Canadian Solar, after I launched my campaign to expose them, has of course removed all references to their partnership with GCL Poly from their website. But of course, archive form and press reports means that we still have the evidence of it. As of December 2021, Canadian Solar's primary suppliers are Longyet Green Energy, Honghua New Material and Tongwei Solar, all companies with subsidiaries operating in Xinjiang with links to Uyghur forced labour. I have provided full written briefs on each company's links to the forced labour to DESNZ in the past. Now, in June 2022, Madam Deputy Speaker, Canadian Solar's own shareholders attempted to deselect several board members. Why? Inaction over forced labour in their own supply chains. In December 2022, the US Commerce Department found Canadian Solar guilty of tariff dodging. This means that they took their solar panels from China to Thailand, tried to disguise them, and then shipped them to the US. But they were caught out. Sadly, the attitude of the company is best discerned by a leaked email from their CFO, Chang, who faulted human rights organisations for their work when he said, "They mistakenly regard any employment of Uyghurs as forced labour, which has caused severe harm to the Uyghurs we all love." There you have it, Madam Deputy Speaker. According to Canadian Solar senior management, the responsibility for the genocide and the use of slave labour does not lie with the Chinese Communist Party and the companies who use their labour for profit. It lies with the brave NGOs and human rights groups who dare to highlight their plight. All the evidence is there. I have raised it countless times, and so I want to ask the Minister directly, will we now change the MSIP rules so that the links to forced labour are finally considered? Because I don't believe there is any other form of procurement in this country, particularly public sector procurement or for the national good, where we don't take forced labour into consideration. Will the government act against blood labour-made products polluting our shores? And if not, why? I want to preempt, rather cheekily, what I think the Minister may raise here, which is the Solar Stewardship Initiative. Anyone who's followed my interventions again will know that I've been very sceptical of an industry-led solution to this problem. The Solar Stewardship Initiative, led by Solar UK, was published last September. Its ESG doc, however, does not mention Uyghur forced labour a single time, despite it being set up to prove that there is no slave labour within their chains. In fact, it devotes only one short paragraph to forced labour, but doesn't set out how it will be identified in supply chains, consequences for companies who are proved to have found to benefit from it. If we go back to the list of companies I gave Madam to speak to, and I recognise it was long, both JA Solar and Jinko Solar, companies ranked as having very high exposure to forced labour, are already certified as SSI members. Apparently there isn't a problem with slave labour in their chains, despite the Foreign Office report saying that there is. I was also very disappointed when Solar Energy UK, when I met with their chief executive, refused to remove Canadian Solar as an industry lobby group, despite the overwhelming evidence against them. I fear we will now see a similar attitude from Solar UK as they come forward, and it does seem, I'm afraid, illogical to allow an industry so tainted by forced labour to be allowed to create its own certification programme with zero, and I mean zero, external oversight. So can the Minister please set out what active mechanism will exist to examine the supply chains of SSI certified members and what the consequences will be for those found to benefit from Uyghur forced labour within their supply chains? And can the Minister confirm that he is confident the SSI will clean up the UK solar market of its connections to Uyghur forced labour? Now, whilst I believe that any solar company with links to Uyghur forced labour should be banned from operating in the UK as a matter of principle, it is also worth investigating what Chinese supply chains mean in practice for our environment and going green. The process of mining and manufacturing solar panels in China relies heavily on coal power. Professor David Rogers, an expert in ecology at the University of Oxford, estimates that due to these coal-dependent supply chains, solar energy produces 3 units of carbon for every 1 unit behind wind energy. Only biomass has a larger carbon footprint than solar from renewable forms of energy. In a study by the World Bank comparing 240 countries, the UK was found to have the second lowest potential for solar photovoltaic potential, with only Ireland less suited to solar energy. Explains why I'm so pale. There is not much sunshine in my English-Irish heritage. Solar installations in the UK, maybe I should talk about Scotland next, but I think I'll move swiftly on. Solar installations in the UK generate maximum power for an average of 2.6 hours a day. They fall to less than 1 hour a day in winter. Solar plants produce energy when we least need it, during hot and sunny periods, and contribute little to nothing during peaks in demand in the winter when it is dark and cold. Battery storage is carbon intensive and can only extend solar power supplies by 2 hours and not in between sessions. So an 140-acre solar plant can provide roughly enough electricity for 9,000 homes, whilst just one wind turbine in the North Sea can power 16,000. We are not blessed with abundant sunshine, as I am living proof. But what we do have is wind and plenty of it, and we have the Celtic Sea. So therefore I would ask the Minister why the government continues to sacrifice greenbelt and agriculturally rich land for inefficient, carbon-intensive solar made with Uyghur slave labour, when we should be investing in wind energy, a technology that we rightly lead in, and we should be so proud of our record in wind, where we have achieved enormous things. I want to finish by paying tribute to the member of Sleaford and North Hykenen for securing a debate in Westminster Hall on Thursday this week on solar plants. I hope the Minister will note how many debates are being held on this issue and that members' concerns are significant. Another area that has been increasingly raised is the need to protect best and most versatile agricultural land. Responding to a written question I submitted in February, the Minister for Nuclear and Renewables confirmed that DESNZ is not currently monitoring what types of land or how much land is being used for solar developments across our country and has no plans to do so. That, for me, is deeply concerning as someone who has over 400 farms in their constituency. How is the Department able to answer members' questions about how much BNB land is being lost if the government themselves are not recording it? Although I have had a conversation this week with the Secretary of State for Farming, and he does give me hope that DEFRA may be recording this information. The Malard Pass solar plant alone would see 1,000 acres of Grade 1, not Grade 2, not Grade 3, Grade 1 BNB land lost, and yet maybe this would not even be recorded by the government. And whilst the total amount of UK land used for solar might be small, the type of land being lost is key. Crops and solar like the same thing, flat, sunny landscapes, and so it's no surprise that over 50% of all solar applications in this country are in Rutland and Lincolnshire. Two counties that are the breadbasket of the UK are now being concreted over with solar panels. So at a time of global food insecurity, when 46% of our food is currently imported, does the Minister agree with me that food security should be a government priority? And will he instruct his officials to begin monitoring how much, what type and in what areas solar is being built? And I'm very relieved that the Farming Secretary will be bringing forward a national land strategy, again something I've been campaigning for, and I hope this will better protect BNB land. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I met with the government previously to discuss compensation schemes for solar. So could the Minister please provide an update as to when we will expect a new industry standard for solar compensation? It is absolutely right that the wind energy industry came together. They put forward a proposal and it's now standard across the country. And yet, for example, in Rutland, we were offered something like, I think it was £100,000, £400,000 to compensate for the next 40 years of losing 2,100 acres of good quality arable land, with one of our villages, Essendine, 96% surrounded by solar. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, the evidence of Uyghur forced labour in the solar industry supply chain is abundant. It is laid out in Foreign Office funded reports, in the evidence collected by the Foreign Affairs Committee, in sanctions imposed by the US government, and in the documents of the offending companies themselves. Over the last 4 years, I have done all I can to shine a light on this evidence, and now with the support of 42 members of this House and 32 human rights organisations, I have asked for 3 simple policies to bring the UK in line with our international partners so we don't become a dumping ground and we can finally clear up the solar industry. 1, introduce import controls. 2, sanction the worst companies, and 3, enact complementary measures to diversify, because solar should be part of our final makeup of our energy platform. But it must be on buildings, it must be on brownfields, and it must be on grade 4, and that is where it should be. I also asked the Minister to commit to reaching out to his counterparts in the US and EU to discuss their Uyghur forced labour import controls and how we can learn from them. Our transition to net zero is gathering pace, and we must not let up. I am so proud that we have decarbonised faster than any other major government. It is an incredible achievement what we have done. But we cannot go green off the back of slavery and genocide and blood labour. Our green and pleasant land is being tainted by solar plants produced with this Uyghur blood labour, and it is the responsibility of all of us and the government to prevent this. I see it as a new form of great injustice that we will be going green off the backs of dirty made solar panels in China because we don't see how they're made, not least the dirt and how they're made for the environment where they harm it, but also the slave labour that we then benefit from in our country. I think there is a really concerning historical parallel there. We have the information, we have the solution, and now all we need is some action. Work with our allies, fall in line with international standards, and do what we all know is the right thing, and refuse to allow the Uyghur genocide to continue and yet somehow play a role in it. I know the Minister deeply cares about slave labour. I know the Minister, when he was a backbencher, spoke out frequently on these issues. I also know that he is very aware of the threats from the Chinese Communist parties and the way in which they treat Uyghur activists and all those living in Xinjiang. So I would like to thank him for the fact that his door is always open to me, the fact that he always takes the time to discuss these issues with me. But we do need to take action, and we need to do so now. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Minister Andrew Bowie.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now, let me begin by thanking the Honourable Lady, my honourable friend, and she's a friend, for securing what is an incredibly important debate. I absolutely recognise her dedication and eagerness to tackle this serious issue, noting her recent joint letter to the Secretary of State for Energy Security and Net Zero, alongside the Foreign Secretary and the Secretary of State for Business and Trade. So let me be very clear and get right to the issue. UK businesses and solar developers should not countenance receiving solar panels from companies that may be linked to forced labour. This government has been very clear on its position regarding the abhorrent practice of forced labour and our expectations on companies to do everything in their power to remove any instances of forced labour from their supply chains. That's why it was this Conservative government which introduced new guidance on the risks of doing business in Xinjiang, enhanced export controls and announced the introduction of the financial penalties for those who failed to report as required under the Modern Slavery Act. It was this government which led the charge and announced in September 2020 a requirement of large businesses and public bodies to report on specific areas within their modern slavery statements, including their due diligence processes in relation to modern slavery. And additionally, it was this government which recently passed the Procurement Act to enable public sector contracting authorities to reject bids and terminate contracts with suppliers which are known to use forced labour themselves or anywhere in their supply chain. But this remains a complex issue, Madam Deputy Speaker, and my honourable friend is absolutely right. We must continue to review how we can best tackle forced labour in supply chains. I can promise her that we have not ruled out taking further measures and additional measures in the future. Across every part of government, and not just in the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, we are continuing to engage and work with our international partners to understand the impact of measures to combat forced labour around the world. The United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland has a strong record at holding countries to account for instances of forced labour. The government has led international efforts to make China accountable for its human rights violations in Xinjiang. We were the first country to lead in a joint statement on China's human rights record in Xinjiang at the UN. And our leadership has sustained pressure on China to change its behaviour. Madam Deputy Speaker, in October 2023, the UK led another joint statement on Xinjiang at the UN, and at China's Universal Periodic Review in January, the UK urged China to cease the persecution of Uyghurs, allowing them genuine freedom of religion or belief and cultural expression without fear of surveillance, torture, forced labour or sexual violence. We have also imposed sanctions and consistently raised China's human rights violations with the Chinese authorities at the highest level. The Foreign Secretary last did so with China's Foreign Minister in February. Turning to the issue of the solar sector in general and the presence of forced labour in solar supply chains. First, I should probably set out the importance of solar energy as a key part of the government's strategy for net zero, energy independence and growth. We are aiming, as the Honourable Lady said, for 70 gigawatts of solar capacity by 2035. The UK does have huge potential for solar power. It's a cheap, versatile and effective technology that is a key part of the government's strategy for net zero, energy independence and clean growth. As a part of a wider energy mix, and the Honourable Lady was absolutely right to reference our strong leadership in offshore wind. We have the first to fifth largest offshore wind farms in the world. We're investing in new technologies and indeed in our new nuclear capacity. So it is a part of a wider mix to get to our net zero future. On solar, however, I recently co-chaired the final meeting of the Solar Task Force alongside Solar Energy UK at 10 Downing Street. In fact, within the Solar Task Force, and with thanks to the pressure from my honourable friend here, we established a specific subgroup within that task force to consider the wide-ranging actions needed to develop solar supply chains that are resilient, sustainable, innovative and free from forced labour. This work will inform the government's solar roadmap, due to be published in the next few months, which will set out the trajectory and actions needed to deploy up to 70 gigawatts of 2035. One of the main topics of discussion at the Solar Task Force was the Solar Stewardship Initiative, referenced by the Honourable Lady already this evening, which is a solar supply chain assurance scheme developed, piloted, audited and launched by the UK's main trade association, Solar Energy UK, working alongside its European counterpart, Solar Power Europe. In fact, the UK government co-sponsored the development and publication of Action Sustainability's Addressing Modern Slavery and Labour Exploitation in Solar PV Supply Chains Procurement Guidance to provide further tools to industry to ensure the responsible sourcing of solar panels. Madam Deputy Speaker, I have been largely pleased, actually, to see the response from industry following our work on this, and I'm delighted to highlight that on the 28th of March, 55 companies and organisations across the solar sector signed a supply chain statement highlighting their commitment to ensuring the solar sector is free from any human rights abuses, including forced labour, anywhere in the global supply chain. Resilient, sustainable and innovative supply chains are essential to support the significant increases in solar deployment needed to deliver the UK's ambition for 70 gigawatts of solar capacity by 20. I'd be delighted to give way to the...
I thank my honourable friend for giving way on this point. I met with the Chief Executive of Solar UK, and when I said to him, what happens if one of the companies who signs up to your solar stewardship scheme isn't keeping itself free of slave labour, what will you do? And he didn't have an answer for me. And I said, well, will you kick them out? Will you exclude them? And he said, well, we don't have a mechanism to do that. So have things changed where there is now a mechanism to exclude, and how we're making sure they are actually auditing? Because again, he said they're taking it upon the company's words when they sign up that they are free from slave labour. They are not having to provide any evidence that they are free of slave labour when they sign up for this initiative.
I thank the Honourable Lady for the question. On her latter point, there will be more detail on exactly how the auditing process will proceed when we publish the solar roadmap in the next few months. On her former point, I must be absolutely clear from this dispatch box that if a company is engaging in buying pieces for their equipment that they knowingly know have been developed using slave labour in Xinjiang or indeed anywhere else in the world, they should be held to account, and they absolutely should not be allowed to remain as a part of the initiative. That is absolutely the view of the Department, this Government and indeed the wider industry itself. The Government already encourages developers to grow sustainable supply chains through the supply chain plan process, included in the Contracts for Difference scheme, for a project over 300 megawatts. And yes, my honourable friend.
Quickly, Minister, I understand time's limited. I think the Minister referred to 55 companies, I think it was. I just want to ask, those 55 companies, I'm presuming that within those companies there are companies from Northern Ireland as well. It's important that we have a policy that affects all of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, so that they're all accountable.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for the question, and yes, I can assure him that if this covers what we are speaking about this evening, and the industry initiatives that I am laying out this evening covers every part of our United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And if any companies are involved within Northern Ireland, then of course they will be covered by these schemes, these initiatives, and indeed by the legislation that we have passed to ensure that we do get to the root cause, which is to remove slave labour from the supply chain. The UK has scope to grow industries producing innovative solar technology, whilst also crystallising our position as world leaders in cutting-edge solar research and development. In doing so, we can create new green jobs, providing levelling up and significant export opportunities, while building up UK capability and resilience and increasing energy security by reducing our reliance on imports. Meanwhile, we support the efforts of our allies to increase and accelerate the diversification of solar supply chains by reshoring manufacturing. We continue to work with countries like the US, Canada and Germany to ensure access to these solar supply chains remains resilient. The Honourable Lady also referred to the situation of solar on agricultural land. And the Government recognises that in some instances solar projects can affect the local environment. It is important the Government can strike the right balance between these considerations and securing a clean, green energy system for the future. That is why the planning system is designed to take account of these issues. However, I am aware of the number of issues arising from these deployments, these planned applications, and I am engaging and discussing with many colleagues and indeed their communities on this, and seeing what we can do to ensure that those communities' concerns are indeed listened to. So I'd like to close by again thanking my honourable friend for bringing forward this important debate. I look forward to continuing to engage with her on this vitally important issue.
Thank you. The question is that this House do now adjourn. As may that opinion say aye. Aye. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order.
has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.